It was a bitterly cold evening in December when a small, bedraggled creature huddled against the icy walls of a convenience store. The street lights flickered above, casting long shadows across the empty sidewalk, while the wind howled through the narrow alleyways. The city felt deserted, everyone tucked away in their warm homes, cozy under blankets, or gathered around the glow of their fireplaces. But not this poor, shivering soul. A stray cat, thin and scruffy, with fur matted from the cold, sat near the store's entrance. His bright green eyes, wide with fear and confusion, scanned the street, searching for something, anything. His paws were raw from the harsh winter pavement, and his tiny body trembled from the freezing temperature. A thick layer of snow had already begun to cover the streets, and the cat's fur, damp from the wet snowflakes, clung to his fragile frame. Despite his best efforts to stay hidden in the shadow of the store, he was fully aware of how alone he was. This wasn't his first night out in the cold, but something about this night felt different. The chill in the air wasn't just biting at his fur, it was sinking deep into his bones, and the hunger gnawing at his stomach felt more desperate than ever. He was astray, alone by circumstances beyond his control. Perhaps once, he had known warmth, maybe even affection, but all that seemed like a distant dream now. His world was cold, barren, and unforgiving. But he couldn't quite remember how long he had been out there, only that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be full, to be cared for. Now, the wind cut through his body like 1,000 tiny needles, each gust of cold air threatening to push him further away from the warmth he so desperately needed. The sound of a door opening broke the stillness. A middle-aged woman stepped out of the convenience store, balancing a grocery bag in one hand while clutching a steaming cup of coffee in the other. She noticed the little cat immediately, huddled against the store's door, his body shaking like a leaf in the wind. Her heart softened. "Oh, you poor thing," she whispered under her breath, her voice carrying an empathetic lilt. The cat froze at the sound of her voice, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, they shared a silent understanding, one of fear, of loneliness, of desperate hope. But before she could take another step toward him, the cat bolted into the dark alleyway, disappearing into the night. The woman stood frozen for a moment, staring at the spot where the cat had been. Her heart ached at the thought of such a fragile life braving the brutal cold alone. She knew she couldn't just leave him out there. The woman glanced back at the convenience store, as if contemplating what to do. She took a deep breath, made a decision, and walked back inside. By the time she had gathered a few essentials, some food, a blanket, and a small makeshift shelter from the cardboard boxes in the store's back alley, the snow had begun to fall more heavily. The streetlights dimmed as the snowflakes danced lazily in the night air. She could hear her heart racing, though she wasn't sure why. This wasn't her first encounter with a stray animal. But something about this cat felt different. With the bundle in her arms, she ventured out into the alley. The cat was nowhere to be seen at first, but she didn't give up. She called softly into the cold air, her voice almost swallowed by the storm. "Hey, little one. It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." She knew it was a long shot, but there was something about that cat's eyes that made her believe he might be different from the others. He seemed to understand her, even if he wasn't ready to trust yet. The snow was falling thick now, and she wondered if the cat was out there at all. Her feet were beginning to get cold, and her fingers were numb from the frozen air. She was about to turn back when, from behind a pile of old crates, a pair of glowing green eyes stared back at her. The cat had returned. The woman froze, her breath catching in her throat as the cat's green eyes shimmered out from the darkness. For a long moment, neither moved. The cat, his fur matted and dirty, gazed at her with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. His body still trembled, not just from the cold but from the uncertainty of what would happen next. The woman's heart swelled with compassion. She took a slow, steadying breath and crouched down, lowering her body to make herself less intimidating. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered softly, her voice barely above a breath. "I just want to help." Her hands trembled as she carefully set down the small cardboard box filled with food and a folded blanket. She knew she had to be patient. Strays, especially those who had suffered, were cautious, and sometimes, all they needed was time. Time to understand that not everyone was a threat. Time to heal. For a few moments, the cat didn't move, but his eyes never left her. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he took a cautious step forward, his nose twitching as the scent of food filled the air. The woman's heart leapt. She hadn't expected him to trust her immediately, but he was at least curious. That was a start. "Go ahead," she said gently, her voice like a soft breeze. "It's okay." The cat sniffed the air again, his body tense, but he couldn't resist. He padded closer to the food, his paws silent on the snow-covered ground. He took a small, tentative bite of the soft fish she had set out, then pulled back quickly, as if expecting something to happen. But nothing did. No sudden movements, no loud noises. Just the quiet, steady warmth of her presence. As he began to eat, the woman allowed herself a sigh of relief. She watched him for a while, waiting until he finished his meal. When he was done, he sat back on his haunches, licking his lips, his green eyes still watching her from the shadows. The woman didn't move, not wanting to rush him. After what felt like an eternity, the cat stood up and cautiously padded over to the cardboard box she had set down. His nose twitched again, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate. Then, to the woman's surprise, he slipped inside the box and curled up into a tight little ball. She didn't want to frighten him by getting too close, but she could see the faint rise and fall of his chest, a little steadier than before. A soft, satisfied sigh escaped her lips. He was willing to trust, even just a little. It was a start, and it was enough for now. The woman carefully backed away, leaving him to rest. She knew she couldn't expect him to come inside just yet, not after all he had been through. Instead, she resolved to check on him every night. She would bring him food and warmth, and little by little, she would show him that not all humans were a threat. As the days passed, their unspoken bond grew. Each evening, she would return to the alley, finding him waiting for her, always a little more trusting than before. Sometimes he would eat quickly and retreat into the shadows, but other times, he would stay and watch her with those captivating green eyes, allowing her to move a little closer. And every so often, he would let her give him a tentative stroke on his back, just a brief touch before he darted away again. But she could see the changes in him. The once thin, shivering creature that had first appeared at her door was starting to fill out, his coat becoming shinier, his fur softer. He was regaining some of his strength. And with that strength, his courage grew too. One night, after several weeks of caring for him, she arrived to find the little cat waiting for her by the entrance to the alley, his tail flicking back and forth. He didn't bolt when he saw her approach. Instead, he stepped forward, stopping just a few feet away, and sat down, watching her with those now familiar, bright green eyes. The woman held out her hand slowly, cautiously, offering him a piece of tuna from a small container. Her voice was soft but encouraging. "Come on, little one," she murmured. "I won't hurt you." For a long moment, the cat looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, as if making a decision, he took a few hesitant steps forward and reached out to nibble the tuna from her hand. Her breath caught in her throat, and she smiled with tears in her eyes. It was a tiny moment, a simple gesture, but to her, it felt like everything. The woman's heart swelled with hope. He was no longer the scared, shivering stray who had first crossed her path. He was beginning to trust her. He was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a place for him in this world. And that night, after he finished his meal, he didn't retreat back to the alley. Instead, as she gently stroked his fur for the first time without him running away, she whispered softly to him, "I'll keep you safe, I promise. You don't have to be alone anymore." And for the first time in a long while, the little cat believed her. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the bond between the woman and the stray cat grew stronger. She had learned to call him Milo, a name that seemed to fit him perfectly, small, yet determined, with a quiet strength that shone through his eyes. Milo had come to expect her visits every evening. He no longer darted away the moment she arrived but would sit by the alley's entrance, waiting for her to come to him. Slowly, the fear in his eyes had turned to curiosity, then to affection. And with that change, his trust in her had blossomed. One crisp evening, as the winter days began to give way to the faint warmth of spring, the woman made a decision. She knew that Milo was ready. He had been living in the alley for far too long, and he deserved so much more than the cold, lonely street. It was time for him to come inside. She approached him slowly, as she always had, holding her hand out as she crouched down to his level. But this time, there was a change. Milo didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, brushing his head gently against her fingers, the way a cat would do to someone he trusted completely. She could hardly believe it. Her heart swelled, and for a moment, all she could do was stroke the soft fur of his head, overwhelmed by the simple joy of this moment, the culmination of weeks of patience and care. "Are you ready to come home?" she whispered, her voice full of wonder and love. Milo's answer was a soft, rumbling purr, the sound vibrating through his small body. It was the first time she had heard him purr, and it made her smile. It was a sound of contentment, of safety. The woman carefully picked him up, cradling him in her arms, feeling the warmth of his small body pressing against her chest. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. In her arms, Milo felt light, as though all the burdens of his past life, the cold, the hunger, the fear, had been lifted away. As she walked back toward her apartment, he nestled into her arms, purring softly, the beginning of a new chapter in his life unfolding. When they reached her home, she opened the door gently, allowing him to explore the warmth of the inside. The scent of freshly brewed tea and soft blankets filled the air. The apartment was small, cozy, and filled with light. It was nothing grand, but it was warm, just what Milo needed. The first few days were quiet. Milo explored every corner of the apartment, his little paws patting softly against the hardwood floors. He found his favorite spot, a small sunlit windowsill where he would curl up and nap, watching the birds and the world go by. He seemed to enjoy the simplicity of the space, relishing in the comfort of a place where he didn't have to fight for food or shelter, where he didn't have to hide in the shadows. The woman kept Milo's routine simple. She fed him small meals of tuna and chicken, watched over him as he grew stronger, and gave him all the attention he craved. And in return, Milo began to show more and more affection. He would follow her from room to room, sitting by her feet as she worked, brushing against her legs when she would stop to pet him. Occasionally, he would jump onto her lap, curling up with a contented purr as she stroked his fur. It was a dream for both of them, a quiet, peaceful existence filled with the joy of companionship. Milo had gone from being a scared, hungry stray to a confident, loving cat who had found his place in the world. And the woman, who had been so lonely before, now found herself blessed with a quiet, steadfast friend who filled her home with love and laughter. But as the days passed, she began to notice something even more remarkable. Milo wasn't just thriving physically. There was a sparkle in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a sense of happiness and confidence that came from knowing he was loved. It was as if he knew he had been rescued, not just from the cold of the streets but from the darkness of being alone. One morning, as the sun peeked through the curtains and bathed the room in a soft, golden light, the woman awoke to find Milo curled up on her bed, his tiny body stretched out beside her, his head resting gently on her pillow. She smiled, reaching out to stroke his fur. He opened one green eye lazily and looked at her, his tail twitching in greeting. "Milo," she whispered softly, "you've come so far." He blinked at her, a little purr rumbling in his throat, and then nuzzled her hand, as if to say, "I know. And I'm so happy to be here." She laughed softly, feeling a warmth in her heart that she hadn't known before. "Me too, little one. Me too." Over time, Milo became not just a companion, but a part of her family. He would curl up next to her when she watched TV, stretch out on the couch in the evenings as she read, and even greet her at the door when she came home from work, his tail high with excitement. No longer did he hide from the world, fearful of what might happen next. Now, he was confident, secure, and content, knowing that he had a place in this world, a place where he was loved, cared for, and safe. And though the woman had never expected that one cold night outside a convenience store would change her life forever, she knew in her heart that it had been the best decision she had ever made. Because Milo, this small, resilient cat, had given her a gift too, a gift of unconditional love, of joy, and of companionship that made everything else in life feel brighter. Milo's story, the story of a stray cat who had found a new chance at life, was one of healing. And together, he and his new owner thrived in the warmth of their shared home, both forever grateful for the fateful night when a simple act of kindness had changed everything. And in that home, they both found their happily ever after.